They said Africa should wait for permission. They said India should not cross that line. But here we are, Nigeria and India signing an oil deal the world wasn't ready for. This isn't just business. It's a statement, a message that power is shifting, quietly but surely, from the old empires to the global south. For decades, the United States held the key to every barrel of oil sold on this continent. Not through ownership, but through control. Control of currency, control of policy, control of who gets to trade and who must beg. But in 2025, something changed. India didn't ask. Nigeria didn't wait. Together, they wrote a new chapter, one that defies US sanctions, bypasses the dollar, and puts African energy back in African hands. And as Washington watches from across the Atlantic, a quiet fear begins to grow. Because this isn't just a deal, it's the beginning of a new alliance, one that could rewrite who holds power in Africa's oil future. This is the story of the deal that dared to challenge America, not to the closed-door meetings behind oil-stained walls in Lagos, but something was happening, something that would shake the quiet corridors of Washington. Because this time, Africa didn't ask for permission, and India didn't wait for approval. In 2025, Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, signed a new energy deal with India worth billions of dollars. But this wasn't just about oil, it was about defiance. It was about rewriting the rules that have defined global power for half a century. For decades, every drop of oil that left African soil carried an invisible stamp, approved by the dollar. Every trade, every transaction, every promise, all passed through the same Western gatekeepers. You could sell your oil, but not without permission. You could build your refinery, but not without conditions. And if you refused, the system would punish you through sanctions, loans, or silence. But now, India and Nigeria have done the unthinkable. They've built a trade that flows outside that system, paid not in dollars, but in rupees, naira, and trust. It is the kind of move Washington never expected from two nations that were once seen as the developing world. And yet, here they are building something new, while the old powers scramble to understand how it happened. To America, it's not just an oil deal, it's a warning shot, because for the first time in decades, an African nation has signed a major energy agreement without consulting the West, without fearing retaliation, and without needing Western approval. For Nigeria, this isn't rebellion, it's restoration. The restoration of agency, the restoration of dignity. A reminder that Africa's resources are not bargaining chips in someone else's economy. And for India, this deal is survival. A nation of 1.4 billion people hungry for energy, tired of being caught between sanctions and global politics. India knows what it means to depend, to be told who it can buy from, and when it must stop. So it looked to Africa, a continent full of what the world needs. And at last, ready to decide who deserves it. Together, India and Nigeria have drawn a new map, a South-South alliance that bypasses the old routes of power from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And while Washington calls it a concerning trend across Africa, people are calling it something else: freedom. You see, Africa remembers. It remembers the years when its oil built empires abroad, while its people lived in darkness at home. It remembers when partnership meant extraction and aid meant control. But now the script is flipping. Africa is no longer the background of someone else's story. It is the author of a new one, and this oil deal is the first sentence. But make no mistake, Washington has noticed. Behind closed doors, officials are asking, how far will this go? What if Nigeria's model spreads? What if the dollar loses its grip on Africa's energy? Because if India can buy Nigerian oil without using the dollar, then maybe Angola can trade with China in yuan, maybe Ghana can sell gold to the way in dirhams, maybe the rules of global trade written in Western ink can finally be rewritten in African handwriting, and that's what truly scares Washington. This isn't just about currency, it's about control. For half a century, US sanctions have been a weapon, a way to decide who trades and who doesn't, who grows and who falls. But that weapon only works if the world keeps using the same money, the same banks, the same system. Now, for the first time, a new system is forming, one that doesn't need approval, and it started right here in Africa. Not in Beijing, not in Moscow, but in Lagos on a warm night, when India and Nigeria shook hands and decided to do things differently, to trade oil without fear, to build without permission, to grow without apology. And as the ink dried on that contract, Washington's power began to tremble quietly, invisibly, but unmistakably. Because history doesn't always announce itself with wars or speeches. Sometimes it changes with a signature on a deal no one saw coming. What we're witnessing is not just a trade partnership. It's the beginning of a new global order, one where Africa is no longer the resource, but the partner, where India isn't following the West, but leading the South. A world where decisions are made in Abuja, New Delhi, and Johannesburg, not just in Washington, London, or Brussels. So when you hear Washington's concern, when you see headlines about sanction risks or financial instability, remember this: it's not fear of failure, it's fear of change, because that's what this deal represents, a change the old powers cannot stop, and the new powers will not reverse. India's new oil deal with Nigeria isn't just about energy. It's about independence for both nations, and for every country that dares to trade on its own terms. And as Washington watches from across the ocean, one truth becomes clear: the age of control is ending, and the age of cooperation, led by the global South, has just begun. It began with a ship no one noticed, a silent convoy moving west across the Indian Ocean, its destination, a port once known only for colonial exports, now the front line of a new global realignment. Because for the first time in modern history, Africa's largest oil producer isn't looking west, it's looking east. To India. For decades, the rules of oil were written in Washington. Prices, payments, even the pipelines of diplomacy flowed through American power. But somewhere between 2020 and 2025, that grip began to loosen. The dollar's dominance faced new challengers, and a quiet rebellion started across the global South. India saw the cracks first. The world's fastest growing energy consumer needed more than promises, it needed partners. So New Delhi turned toward nations that shared its hunger for independence, not its fear of consequences. And in West Africa, it found a mirror image, a nation rich and crude, weary of dependency, ready to redefine its alliances. Nigeria supplies nearly 2 million barrels of oil a day, yet decades of export dependency left it vulnerable. When Western sanctions rippled through global markets, prices spiked, shipping routes shifted, and African producers faced a stark choice: follow Washington's lead, or find new buyers. India didn't hesitate. It offered open contracts, local investment, and most importantly, trade in currencies outside the dollar. To Washington, it looked like economic pragmatism. To others, it looked like defiance. Every new shipment between India and Nigeria is more than oil, it's a statement. It says the global South no longer waits for permission to trade with itself. A decade ago, that idea sounded impossible. Today, it's the blueprint for a post-American energy order. Across Africa, refineries built with Asian capital are processing African crude for Asian demand, from Kenya's solar grids to Angola's deep-sea rigs. A new ecosystem of energy independence is taking shape, one where India is no longer a distant partner, but a daily presence. Yet behind every new deal lies a question that keeps policymakers in Washington awake: if India and Africa can build an oil corridor that functions beyond the dollar, what else can they build without it? American officials frame it as a diversification of trade, but beneath the language of diplomacy is a growing realization: the sanctions era, the quiet enforcement tool that once dictated who could buy, sell, or prosper, is losing its reach, not through confrontation, but through cooperation elsewhere. Each new memorandum between India and Nigeria chips away at a century-old hierarchy of energy. It signals that the global South is done playing by rules it didn't write. For Nigeria, it's a path to sovereignty. For India, it's leverage, the kind once held only by Western oil majors and OPEC cartels. And for America, it's an unfolding puzzle: how to maintain global leadership when the world's largest democracies no longer follow its economic script. Some call it the birth of a new energy bloc. Others, the first chapter of a digital and oil revolution linking the South Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Whatever the name, the shift is undeniable. Tankers move where they were once forbidden. Contracts are signed in new currencies, and a quiet sense of autonomy echoes from Abuja to Mumbai. This isn't just a story about barrels of crude. It's a story about power, who controls it, who distributes it, and who finally learns to live without asking permission. Because when India and Nigeria trade freely, they're not just exchanging oil, they're exchanging the right to imagine a world where Washington's fear is no longer everyone else's boundary. When history turns, it never announces itself. It moves in the shadows across boardrooms, back channels, and shipping lanes. And in 2025, one of those turns began quietly, far from Washington's gaze. In Lagos, at first it looked like just another trade deal, a $10 billion agreement between Indian refiners and Nigeria's National Petroleum Corporation. But hidden within the fine print was something more radical, a payment structure that could bypass the US dollar entirely. No dollars, no Western banks, no waiting for approval. The deal was designed to protect both sides from global volatility, but its ripple effect was unmistakable. If successful, it would become the first major African oil trade, settled entirely through local Andrew P-based payment systems. And that scared Washington more than any speech or summit could. For 50 years, the petrodollar ruled the global economy. Every barrel traded in dollars, every sanction enforced through banking networks controlled by Washington. But now, half a century later, that foundation was beginning to crack, not through rebellion, but through quiet cooperation between the world's emerging powers. India didn't plan to defy America. It planned to survive the 21st century. With its population soaring and energy demand set to double, India couldn't afford to depend solely on Gulf suppliers, not after seeing how sanctions and wars could freeze entire economies overnight. So it turned to Africa, a continent rich in energy, raw materials, and untapped partnerships. Nigeria, in turn, saw something it hadn't seen in decades, a partner that treated it as equal, not dependent. India didn't lecture about governance. It offered refineries, training, and infrastructure, a model strikingly different from Western aid. The message was clear: we'll build with you, not for you. And across Africa, that message resonated like never before. By late 2024, Indian firms had signed new contracts to modernize 3 major Nigerian refineries, a move Western investors once dismissed as too risky. But risk, India believed, was the price of sovereignty. And for Nigeria, sovereignty meant controlling its oil narrative once again. One deal became 5, 5 became 10. And within months, India's oil footprint across Africa was larger than any Western nations except the United States itself. What began as energy trade was fast turning into a geopolitical earthquake. To policymakers in Washington, this wasn't just commerce. It was strategy, the kind that rewrites old hierarchies and redraws global influence maps. Because every Indian investment in Nigeria meant another African nation less reliant on Western capital, and every oil shipment traded outside the dollar meant one less lever of U.S. economic power. By mid-2025, India was importing nearly 12% of its crude from Africa, a record high. But what startled observers wasn't the quantity, it was the pattern. Trade wasn't flowing through Western intermediaries anymore. It was direct, bilateral, and settled in non-dollar currencies. That's when Washington realized this wasn't just India buying oil. It was India building a system. Behind the scenes, the BRICS alliance was quietly testing a new energy settlement mechanism, a multi-currency exchange that would make sanctions harder to enforce. And Nigeria's oil deal with India was the prototype. What began as economics was evolving into a political statement. In Lagos, it meant new jobs, new refineries, and a stake in a global partnership. In New Delhi, it meant energy security and a growing voice in Africa's future. But in Washington, it meant something else. Entirely the slow erosion of leverage. America can't sanction half the world, the analyst says. And India's Africa strategy just proved that. From copper in Zambia to crude in Nigeria, the story was the same. India was everywhere, and the old gatekeepers couldn't stop it. Africa's resources, once extracted for Western profit, were now being negotiated on new terms: fairer, faster, freer, and for the first time, African leaders could choose their partners, not be told who they should trade with. This was the power shift Washington didn't predict, a silent realignment built not on confrontation but on opportunity. Because as America looked inward, the rest of the world looked for alternatives, and India, patient and pragmatic, offered exactly that. No speeches, no declarations, just deals. Written in ink, powered by ambition, and carried on the backs of ships sailing quietly across the Atlantic. And as those ships move, so does history away from the old centers of power toward a new world being built in silence, one oil deal at a time. In Washington, silence is never just silence, it's calculation. And when word reached the capital that India had sealed an oil deal with Nigeria outside the dollar system, that silence turned to static behind closed doors. On the surface, the US called it a routine partnership. Behind the scenes, it was treated like a geopolitical earthquake. For decades, Africa's oil had flowed through Western systems, from Nigerian rigs to European refineries, from US dollars to Wall Street banks. Now, a single deal threatened to rewire that circuit. Officially, Washington couldn't stop it. Nigeria wasn't under full sanctions, but the method of payment, non-dollar, non-SWIFT, posed a direct challenge to America's economic leverage. And in geopolitics, challenges like that don't go unanswered. The US response didn't come through missiles or mandates. It came through influence, the art of pressure, wrapped in diplomacy. Within weeks, American envoys were dispatched across West Africa, offering new aid packages, security partnerships, and energy modernization. Funds. The message was polite, but the motive was clear. Re-anchor Africa before India cements its foothold. Washington called it strategic re-engagement, but too many African diplomats, it felt more like VU, promises of investment, warnings about foreign interference, all familiar lines, this time aimed not at Beijing but at New Delhi. While India was building refineries, Washington was building narratives. News outlets began questioning the transparency of India's deals. Think tanks published reports about resource dependency and data security, and slowly the conversation shifted from cooperation to caution. The battle wasn't over oil anymore, it was over perception. If India can buy sanctioned oil or bypass US systems, then anyone can. That undermines the entire global order. To Washington, the real danger wasn't the loss of one deal, it was the loss of precedent. If India and Nigeria could trade freely, what would stop Egypt or Angola or even South Africa from doing the same? And once that domino fell, the dollar's grip on global energy could loosen forever. So Washington launched what insiders quietly called Containment 2.0, new visa restrictions, trade reviews, whisper campaigns about corruption and non-compliance. Nothing official, nothing provable, but enough to slow momentum. Behind every headline about cooperation, there was a quiet hand tugging at the brakes. In Lagos, shipments began facing sudden technical inspections. In Delhi, certain financial transactions were flagged for further review. No one said the word sanctions, but everyone felt their shadow. Even so, the flow didn't stop. It just found new routes. For every barrier built, India and Nigeria built a workaround. Alternate banks in the Gulf, private shipping consortia, currency swaps with the way. Washington could pressure, but it couldn't contain. India's growing role in Africa isn't just economic, he warns. It's strategic. If we lose Africa to new powers, we lose our leverage over the 21st century energy market. For the first time, the US found itself reacting, not dictating. India wasn't an adversary, but it wasn't an obedient ally either. It was something new, a self-reliant power, charting its own map of influence. At the BRICS summit that year, India proposed a bold initiative. A shared energy corridor linking African suppliers to Asian refineries through a non-dollar trade route. To Washington, that was no longer a regional experiment. It was a declaration of independence, and that headline said it all. For decades, America had focused its containment strategy on Beijing, but while eyes were locked on China, India had quietly become the other variable. Not confrontational, but transformative. Analyst 1. India's too important to punish. Analyst 2. Then how do you control it? Control. That word echoed through the corridors of Washington as if the world could still be managed the way it was in the 20th century. But the truth was simpler and harder to accept. Control was fading. Influence was fragmenting. And Africa was no longer a chessboard, it was a player. As the months passed, Washington recalibrated. It began courting the very countries that had drifted toward India. Partnership talks resumed. Aid was repackaged. But something fundamental had changed. The old formula, dollars for loyalty, no longer worked. Because nations had seen another path. Narrator soft, cinematic. For every handshake in Washington, there was a partnership in Africa. And for every policy drafted in DC, there was a deal being signed in Abuja, written in rupees instead of dollars. The empire wasn't collapsing. It was evolving, forced to share a world it once commanded alone, and in that quiet transformation, India and Africa found their moment not as defiers of America, but as architects of a new order where power was no longer dictated but negotiated.